It's a slightly long answer, but let me tell you this. There is a paradox today. Our country is bankrupt. The external world is keen to provide assistance as quickly as possible and is waiting for a cabinet that can properly handle the flow. And the country itself is taking its time. Usually it's the other way around, and it is clear that the IMF can be skeptical under such circumstances. Let's ask ourselves what is at stake? The IMF managing director said that it is normal that those who benefited most from the system contribute most in eliminating the losses from the system. This is exactly what I kept saying for months and fighting for. And this is reflected in the government program. Those who contribute most are, or who should contribute most, and it is in the government program, are one, the politician thieves who stole public money, two, the insiders to whom the governor of the central bank gave billions through the so-called financial engineering, three, the bankers who earned more than $65 billion over the past decades and are asked to contribute to their own institutions. The bankers became their institutions' worst enemies, by the way. Only what remains is to be sorted out through a limited bail-in with around 15% of the deposits accounts that are above $10 million. This is why the IMF and the whole international community backed the plan of the government. The BDL, most bankers, and some MPs who have big interests in the system orchestrated the attack, and the government started to surrender despite the massive support from donors and lenders. When it became obvious that the financial delinquents were winning against the cabinet, which was, by the way, sabotaged from within, I decided to quit. The simple explanation is that the elites are not interested in citizens' purchasing power, nor in depositors' rights, nor in the economy's recovery, not even in social stability. They are only interested in preserving every penny and every advantage they have. No reforms, no solidarity, and even, willing to go as far as a civil war. This is why I thought that no solution was possible at this point in time. And by the way, no solution without the IMF was ever implemented. We're not dying for an IMF program, but if there was nothing else for that. And no credible program with the IMF is being discussed. We were only playing time. Can you believe that a few MPs were challenging the figures of the Ministry of Finance and those of the IMF itself because they concurred with the Ministry of Finance's figures? We were going as far as ridiculing ourselves and our institutions simply to sabotage the plan and to gain time. And by gaining time, depositors are losing their money through haircut, and the normal citizens are losing their purchasing power through the deterioration of the exchange rate. Well, first, economically speaking, Lebanon has suffered a terrible setback a few days ago. The amount of destruction is just amazing. No accurate figure is clear yet. I don't believe the 15 billion figure, but in any case, the tragedy, the human tragedy, the social one, the economic one, are absolutely tremendous. But we have to keep in mind that when the state doesn't perform any of its duties the way it should, people become irresponsible at all levels. And this leads to criminal irresponsibility. Our system is one where all responsibilities are diluted. The highest executive body, let's not forget, is the Council of Ministers as a whole. No responsibility can be traced upward to reach one single individual. Take electricity, for example. Who's responsible? It's been decades now. EDL? No. The Minister of Energy and Water, he would tell you, well, I'm only part of a group. The Prime Minister cannot do it on his own. The President has no executive powers. So there is nobody who's responsible. They are all together responsible, which means that it is a totally diluted responsibility. Now, what this means is that the lack of responsibility is embedded in the system. The judiciary doesn't go high enough, which means that there is no justice. To have real justice, you have to go as high as possible. And let's remember that this system was made for militiamen who didn't want to be held responsible for anything. And it spreads to all levels within the system. No accountability ultimately means criminal lack of responsibility. This is what it means. And the implication of that shouldn't be only about money and reconstruction. This is important, of course, but it has to be, before everything else, revisiting this system to finally make it a workable one, a livable one. Well, let's say that the political elites not only can afford it, but as I said, are willing to go as far as a civil war just to avoid losing ground. And the political elites thought they could mold the IMF support the way they wanted with the active role of our central bank. Support without real reforms, basically. Getting the money but not changing the system, which is what happened previously during the Paris 2 and Paris 3 conferences and other occasions. Some make up as usual and they buy time, just like the central bank has always done. The only policy of the Central Bank of Lebanon has always been to buy time. But this time precisely, our plan was credible and good. And the international community made it hers because they were hoping for this for a very long time. And the IMF was no longer willing to accept wrong figures and insufficient measures. Let's remind everybody that the IMF made it clear at 5 occasions, loud and clear, that the government's figures were the right ones and the government approach was the right one. So anyway, when they saw that the seriousness of the program and the changes it implied, they used MPs and media to torpedo the process. But for how long? That's the question. This behavior is changing the face of Lebanon. The middle class is vanishing and leaving. The poor are helpless, with potentially these people becoming militias and criminality spreading among them. And the happy few are tightening the grip and killing the hope in every citizen. This is an unsustainable situation, but the elites are still willing to take this instead of going for real reforms that would jeopardize their advantages and positions. Well, I respond to that in 2 ways. First, the figures that were provided by the government plan were approved by every serious institution throughout the world. IMF, World Bank, all the bilateral countries, all the serious banks around the world, namely Bank of America and many others. And obviously, the Bank Association is not here to provide figures for the government. They have something at stake here, and we cannot rely on what people who have things at stake as numbers. Obviously, it is very clear that our numbers were correct. It is very clear that the Bank Association and the central bank had to admit that those numbers were correct. And they finally said that, well, yes, we accept them, but maybe we could start negotiating at a higher or lower level. But reality is that we don't negotiate figures. We negotiate how to eliminate the losses, how to distribute the burden of the losses, not the size of the losses themselves. Because if we start doing that, any program that we will build on wrong figures will have very detrimental effects on the country. So this is one point. The second point is that the Bank Association came out with an alternative plan, supposedly, to the government plan. Well, it became very clear to everyone that this was not a plan. I mean, we cannot use public assets to cover every single loss in the system. This is just not acceptable. And by the way, there is not enough public assets for that. And second, if they want to rely on a plan that basically doesn't account for the losses, pretends that it can be spread over time, this means that depositors are going to pay the price because they will not have access to the deposits and they will witness haircuts all the time whenever they need their money. It means that the normal citizen in Lebanon is going to pay through depreciation of the currency because things will not stabilize before losses disappear. And it also means that the economy will never be able to bounce back because nobody sends money into a system where banks are still freezing the deposits of their customers. So basically, I don't think there was an alternative. It was all meant, unfortunately, to stop the process, and they managed to do so. The alternative is simply that the system is doing nothing, and by doing nothing, the losses are shifted from the central bank and the banking sector to people's pockets. Those who are paying the price of doing nothing today are the Lebanese citizens and the depositors, and this is criminal. Well, of course, I already did. I did it before my statement in the government plan, and I did it after my statement because I was asked to do so. And obviously, I did, yes. This doesn't mean that I have the names. I don't have any name because there is banking secrecy in Lebanon. But by making simple calculations, we end up finding between 5.5 and $6 billion that left the country when everybody else was forbidden to withdraw $100 from their accounts. And this in itself is not acceptable. And I think that people should be held accountable for this. I think that the question is not necessarily to lift all subsidies. It is before everything else to target who should benefit from those subsidies. The subsidies that are in place are benefiting mostly to those who don't need them. And what we need to do is targeting poverty and making sure that it is the most fragile part of the population that is benefiting from subsidies. When we do that, we would have sorted out most of the issue. And the rest has to be through proper controls, because a sovereign state that insists on the fact that they want to have their say in the support scenario and the reform process should be able at least to fight that kind of illicit activities. So number one, redrawing the subsidy scheme by making sure that those who benefit are those who are really fragile. And number two, do what we have to do to make sure that no cross-border illicit activities are taking place. It can last for as long as the citizens are willing to cope with that. And one cannot blame citizens who have been suffering for more than 45 years without any breath of fresh air. Uh, it will also continue as long as the elites show their unwillingness to take any positive step in the right direction. Basically, we've seen the population go to the streets. We've seen a lot of discontent, of course, but I'm afraid that at some point in time, it is going to become totally unbearable, and we will be under two kinds of pressure. At least the government, any government, will be under two types of pressure. One from the streets, because the population is taking just far too much pain, and one from the external world, because Lebanon is falling into a lawless situation where the international community will probably be scrutinizing whatever is happening. And the situation in which our elites are putting us is a situation whereby the clean money for investment and for support doesn't flow in, which means that it is a country that is going to live on the not so clean money, the elite's money that was smuggled abroad, and also all kinds of illegally earned money that will change the country into a lawless state. Both those situations will force the system to start introducing changes at some point in time. And I'm only hoping that it will happen quickly, whether through the movement of the population or through the sudden enlightenment of the elites, because time is of essence. The more time we are losing, and the more we can feel the amount of suffering that is inflicted on the population.